The thunder of collapsing steel arrives before anyone understands what caused it, as a tower-sized shockwave rolls through downtown and shatters reinforced glass across multiple city blocks, while emergency sirens struggle to rise above the pressure tearing through concrete and support beams. And at the center of the impact, a small bald figure stands inside a crater that should not exist, brushing dust from his gloves in a way that suggests inconvenience rather than effort while civilians run past him in confusion. Above the rising cloud of debris, a streak of blue and red slows against the skyline before descending with deliberate control, turning what should have been a rescue into something far more uncertain, as infrastructure begins to fail in patterns that engineers will later struggle to explain and witnesses will never agree on. This is the moment the world begins to realize that force itself is behaving incorrectly, and that a far larger problem has already started unfolding beneath the damage now spreading outward. Stay with this carefully, because what follows is not a fight that resolves cleanly, but a chain of consequences that permanently reshapes how power functions in this world. Subscribe once so you don't miss how this escalation unfolds, because the next developments will not slow down or undo what has already begun. It begins with a transportation error that no one can explain, a distortion that doesn't ripple outward so much as quietly replace a section of sky, and in the space of less than a second, the upper atmosphere above Metropolis registers an object that wasn't there before. Civilian satellites log a spherical displacement that never resolves into a conventional entry vector, while ground-level security cameras record a man dropping out of open air and landing without any measurable deceleration onto a midtown avenue that had been gridlocked just moments earlier. Asphalt compresses beneath his shoes with a sound like someone pressing their thumb into wet clay, and then rebounds into a shallow crater that spiderwebs into nearby storefront foundations. Traffic lights fail in a cascading line down the block, as if something in the electromagnetic field has decided to blink. The man looks around with the same faint confusion someone might show after stepping off the wrong elevator. Within 2 seconds, the first responders are already moving because that's what they do in this city. And within 3, the figure above them has shifted from a streak to a hovering presence that turns wind into a constant pressure on the street. Superman doesn't arrive with noise so much as absence of it, the air around him displaced in a smooth envelope that keeps glass from shattering, as he drops into position between the crater and the densest concentration of fleeing civilians. He is already cataloging variables the moment his boots touch down, because that is how he has survived this long in a world that throws the impossible at him weekly. The compression pattern in the asphalt suggests impact without kinetic transfer, which does not align with any known extraterrestrial physiology he's encountered, and the lack of heat bloom rules out most propulsion-based entries. The man in the crater has no visible equipment, no armor, and no detectable radiation signature beyond the baseline noise of the city. Saitama brushes dust off his shoulder with a small, practical motion, then looks up at the caped figure with mild interest that does not rise to curiosity. He is not posturing, not adjusting his stance in a way that signals imminent attack, and the set of his shoulders communicates the same casual readiness he would have standing in line at a grocery store. When Superman speaks, his voice is pitched to carry without panic, asking for identification and intent in a tone that has diffused riots before, and the man's response is an apologetic shrug that suggests he may have taken a wrong turn. The words are ordinary enough that, for a split second, the situation seems like it might settle into a controlled conversation rather than a confrontation. Then a nearby building, already compromised by the initial landing, shifts its load-bearing column by a few centimeters, and the physics of the moment refuses to wait. Superman moves first because he has to, intercepting the buckling facade with one hand and redirecting the collapse into a safer angle that will send most of the debris into an empty parking structure. It's the kind of micro-adjustment he makes dozens of times a year, threading force through fragile environments without letting it spike into catastrophe. While he does it, he watches the stranger out of the corner of his eye, expecting some sign of strain or exertion from the impact that brought him here, some measurable curve of durability that can be mapped to response. There is none, and that absence begins to matter when the man steps out of the crater and onto intact pavement without changing pace. The ground accepts his weight as if it has decided to forget what just happened. When the second building across the street begins to shear along its glass curtain wall, Superman accelerates through the air to catch the falling edge, only to register that the collapse has stopped halfway down as if someone pressed pause on gravity. Saitama has reached out with one hand and is holding the structure in place, not with visible effort, but with the absent-minded posture of someone keeping a door from swinging shut. The steel beams that should scream under torsion are silent, and the vibration pattern in the material drops into a stable frequency that defies the stress-load calculations running in Superman's mind. He lowers the first building into its new resting position and turns back just in time to see the man set the second one down with a small, satisfied nod. A third failure occurs because cascading systems don't respect relief, and this time the cause isn't architecture but a ruptured gas main that ignites along a service trench. Flame rolls down the street in a bright, hungry line that will reach a daycare in under 10 seconds unless redirected. Superman crosses the distance in less than a blink and freezes the advancing fire with a precise exhalation, while behind him Saitama swats a falling streetlight out of the path of a bus, with a motion that produces a pressure wave strong enough to rattle windows 3 blocks away. The bus skids, rights itself, and comes to rest without overturning, while the pressure wave dissipates into nothing as if it has decided not to exist past the point of usefulness. The pattern repeats, small interventions that solve problems without revealing the effort behind them. Superman circles once, lowering his altitude to read the man's breathing, his posture, the subtle muscular adjustments that would betray a baseline strength output. He finds none of the telltale signs he expects when someone is suppressing power, no micro-tremors in the quadriceps, no delayed recoil in the tendons after load-bearing. The stranger looks bored, not in the performative way some combatants adopt to bait escalation, but in the literal sense of someone who had planned to be elsewhere today. When a drone from a nearby news station dips too close to the damaged grid and begins to fall, Saitama plucks it out of the air and hands it back to its operator with an awkward little wave that sends another inexplicable gust down the avenue. Protocol demands a test that won't risk lives, and Superman chooses an empty intersection where the road has already been compromised by the initial impact. He asks the man to step back, then applies a calibrated strike to the exposed rebar of a broken median, measuring how the vibration travels through the ground and into nearby structures. The feedback returns clean, predictable, exactly as it should, which is what makes the next part impossible when Saitama taps the same rebar with a single knuckle, and the entire block settles into a lower stress state as if the city itself has relaxed. No fracture propagates, no energy disperses in the ways physics would permit, and yet the outcome is stabilization. He increases the test by a fraction, launching a non-lethal shockwave into the open air above the intersection that should disperse harmlessly. Saitama turns his head at the sound, raises a hand as if to shield his face from wind, and the wave parts around him without altering his shirt. There is no resistance curve to read, no visible absorption, and the absence begins to feel like a missing step in a staircase Superman has climbed his entire life. Around them, emergency crews continue to move, unaware that the assumptions keeping their world consistent have just started to slip. A helicopter loses lift over the riverfront at that exact moment, its tail rotor clipping the wake of the earlier pressure wave, and Superman is already in motion to catch it when Saitama steps forward in the same casual way he used to stop the building. The helicopter's descent halts mid-drop, and for the first time since he arrived, Superman commits to a direct intercept that will force an answer from the man in front of him. He closes the distance with a controlled strike designed to test durability without escalating to harm, because that is how he keeps people safe. His fist meets Saitama's shoulder, and nothing in the world responds the way it should as the helicopter continues to hang in the air, already beginning to tilt toward the river. The contact should have produced something measurable, even if that measurement came back in the form of resistance beyond baseline expectations. But Superman's fist meets Saitama's shoulder and reports nothing that maps onto force as he understands it. There is no counterpressure, no rebound through his wrist or forearm, no microfracture in the surrounding air that would indicate impact at a meaningful scale. And yet the city reacts as though something enormous has just happened. Street-level seismographs stutter in place, registering a vibration that arrives without a waveform, and the helicopter behind them dips another meter before stabilizing again in the stranger's outstretched hand. Saitama glances sideways at the paused aircraft with the same mild annoyance someone might show toward a buzzing fly, as if holding several tons of failing machinery is an interruption rather than an emergency. Superman pulls back immediately because the lack of feedback is itself a warning, and his training insists on reassessment before escalation. He increases his visual acuity, reading capillary dilation and minute changes in muscle tone, looking for any sign that the man is bracing or compensating in ways that would reveal suppressed strength. There is nothing to read beyond a neutral stance and a posture that remains casually aligned, with no shift in center of gravity that would suggest preparation for a counterattack. When Saitama sets the helicopter down onto a cleared section of riverbank with a soft, apologetic pat, the landing skids to a stop without a single additional failure in the airframe. The physics of it refuse to present a curve. A police convoy arrives at the edge of the intersection, officers stepping out with weapons lowered, because the situation has already exceeded the categories their training provides. One of them calls out to Superman by name, asking whether they should clear a wider perimeter, and he nods without taking his eyes off the man in front of him. Saitama seems to interpret the nod as permission to leave, taking a step toward the sidewalk in the direction of a convenience store that somehow still has power. The step compresses the pavement just enough to create a shallow footprint that rebounds into place after his heel lifts, leaving no lasting damage and no visible strain. Superman moves to intercept again, this time positioning himself between Saitama and the densest cluster of civilians still evacuating the block. He speaks calmly, requesting that the stranger remain where he is until the area can be secured, and Saitama's response is an agreeable shrug that does not carry the weight of compliance so much as indifference. The misunderstanding widens when a news drone's live feed catches the moment and broadcasts it across the city, framing the interaction as a standoff rather than a conversation. Within minutes, social media begins to fill with slowed footage of the first strike, analysts attempting to measure deformation in Saitama's shirt that never occurred. The narrative begins to calcify around the assumption that Superman is facing someone who is holding back, someone whose strength has not yet been revealed. Protocol demands escalation when initial tests fail to produce expected results, and Superman chooses a vector that will take them away from the surrounding buildings and into open air. He invites Saitama to follow him to the waterfront under the pretense of ensuring no further structural collapses occur, lifting gently into the sky to create a path that keeps civilians out of any potential line of force. Saitama looks up at him, squints as though evaluating the weather, and then jumps with a motion so small it should not produce lift. The ground beneath him dimples without cracking, and he arrives at rooftop height without any visible arc, landing beside Superman as if he has simply stepped up a stair. Out over the river, the wind picks up enough to carry away stray debris, and Superman takes the opportunity to apply a second calibrated strike, this one directed at Saitama's forearm, with the intent of measuring displacement in open space. The impact again produces no resistance, but the water below them parts into a V-shaped trench that extends for several blocks before collapsing back into itself. Boats rock violently against their moorings, alarms triggering up and down the docks as if an invisible hull has just passed beneath them. Saitama looks down at the disturbed surface with mild interest, then back at Superman with a polite, questioning expression that suggests he is waiting for an explanation. Heat vision is the next logical step because it allows for precision without concussive force, and Superman angles a narrow beam across Saitama's chest at an intensity that would vaporize most known alloys. The light reflects in a way that defies absorption models, skimming the surface of Saitama's suit without leaving scorch or residue, then refracting into the clouds beyond. A line of steam blooms where the beam grazes the river, carving a temporary channel through the surface that closes seconds later. Saitama pats his shirt where the beam touched, more out of habit than concern, and checks for lint. By now, the perimeter has widened to several city blocks, and emergency management begins routing traffic away from the waterfront as if anticipating something they cannot name. A representative from the mayor's office arrives at the command post, asking for a timeline that Superman cannot provide because his threat assessment has lost its gradient. Each increase in applied force has resulted in environmental impact without corresponding interaction at the point of contact, a pattern that suggests his opponent is not resisting in any conventional sense. The conclusion would be absurd if it were not supported by the evidence accumulating beneath them. Saitama yawns into the wind, then gestures vaguely toward the skyline as if asking whether they are finished, and the gesture carries a small pressure change that ripples across the river's surface. Superman feels the air move without understanding why it has moved, the sensation more akin to a change in altitude than a displaced mass. He realizes, with a clarity that settles like cold water, that he cannot measure what he is facing using the tools that have kept this city safe for years. Around them, a container ship begins to drift off course as the current shifts, in response to forces that have no visible origin. He commits to a higher tier of non-lethal engagement, accelerating forward with a controlled burst that should produce enough force to compel a reaction without risking catastrophic harm. The moment his hand closes around Saitama's wrist, the river beneath them dips as if the world has inhaled, and every alarm along the waterfront begins to sound at once. Somewhere upstream, a bridge joint slips by a fraction of a degree, and the consequences of that slip are already moving toward the city faster than anyone can respond. By the time the bridge joint failure is confirmed, the problem has already migrated out of the realm of rescue logistics and into the colder territory of liability, containment, and ownership of information. The slip itself is minor by engineering standards, a fractional misalignment that should have been absorbed by redundant load paths, but the stress distribution that follows does not travel along any mapped support geometry. Instead, it settles into the structure like a decision, redistributing weight in a way that makes the entire span hum at a frequency no maintenance team has ever documented. Traffic is halted within seconds, and the first corporate calls begin before the last civilian vehicle has cleared the approach. At LexCorp Tower, the executive response protocol activates automatically the moment Metropolis infrastructure registers a deviation outside acceptable tolerances. Lex Luthor does not attend the first briefing in person because he prefers to watch events arrive through layers of filtration, the better to understand how they distort in transit. What he sees is a live feed of Superman applying force that should be routine, and a second man whose presence seems to interrupt the expected behavior of matter itself. The data team highlights the absence of recoil in the caped figure strikes, correlating it with seismic anomalies that do not propagate from the point of contact. Insurance markets react faster than government agencies, halting coverage across 3 downtown zones as underwriters attempt to quantify a threat that produces damage without traceable cause. Hospitals prepare for a surge that never arrives, while power utilities initiate rolling isolation of substations to prevent cascading failures if the riverfront disturbance spreads inland. Corporate counsel drafts language around force majeure in anticipation of claims that will hinge on whether the events qualify as an act of God or an act of Superman. The distinction matters for reasons that have nothing to do with physics. Back at the waterfront, Superman releases Saitama's wrist as the alarms crest into a single, continuous tone that seems to flatten the soundscape. The container ship drifting off course has begun to rotate, its bow responding to currents that have not changed according to any buoy in the harbor. Saitama watches the movement with mild curiosity, then steps forward and places a hand against the air in front of him as if checking for rain. The ship stops turning, not with the jerk of applied force, but with the gentle cessation of an argument that has decided to end. A LexCorp drone arrives overhead within minutes, its presence announced by the legal language transmitted on an open channel declaring the airspace under private observation. Superman hears the broadcast and ignores it, focusing instead on the bridge upstream, where the misalignment has begun to migrate along a line of joints like a thought moving through a sentence. Saitama follows his gaze, squinting toward the distant structure with the same expression he might wear while reading a menu. When he hops into the air to get a better look, the wind around him folds inward, creating a brief vacuum that tugs at the river's surface. Inside the tower, Luthor leans forward for the first time as the analytics team overlays stress maps onto live footage of Saitama's interventions. Each time the man touches an object under load, the stress does not dissipate into the surrounding environment, but instead resolves into stability at the exact point of contact. There is no energy transfer that can be monetized, no signature that can be captured and replicated, and the absence of mechanism reads as an insult to every lab Luthor has ever funded. He orders the deployment of a proprietary sensor suite designed to detect exotic interactions, not because he expects it to work, but because failure will be informative. City Hall requests federal assistance under a clause that has not been invoked since the last alien incursion, and the request is granted with the caveat that corporate assets may be requisitioned if necessary. The legal battle begins in parallel with the physical one, fought in conference rooms where the stakes are measured in jurisdiction rather than lives. Meanwhile, the bridge's misalignment reaches a critical hinge, and the first support cable begins to unwind with a sound that carries across the water like distant thunder. Superman is already moving toward it when Saitama arrives ahead of him without any visible transit. He places 2 fingers against the cable and tilts his head, as if listening for something only he can hear, and the unwinding stops. Not slows, not reverses, but stops in a way that leaves the cable suspended mid-failure, its internal stresses held in a configuration no engineer would ever approve. The proprietary sensors above them register nothing beyond ambient noise, and LexCorp's analysts begin to argue in hushed voices about whether the equipment has malfunctioned. Luthor smiles without humor and instructs them to keep recording. Superman lands beside Saitama and reaches for the cable to test whether the stabilization can be maintained under additional load. The moment his hand closes around the steel, the suspended stresses shift, not toward release but toward him, as if the bridge has decided he is now part of its problem. Upstream, another joint slips by a fraction of a degree, and the city's evacuation routes begin to reroute in response to a failure that is no longer localized. Corporate helicopters lift off from rooftops, already angling toward safe zones that have not yet been compromised. The first sign that the problem has spread beyond the waterfront isn't structural collapse, but synchronization, as traffic lights across 3 separate districts begin to change in unison without any command from the city grid. Engineers in the control center assume a software fault until they notice that the timing isn't random, but aligned to the intervals between Superman's movements through the air. Every time he accelerates toward a new failure point, Another system elsewhere in Metropolis compensates for a stress that has not yet arrived, as if the city has started predicting damage before it happens. Hospitals report elevator stalls that resolve the moment Saitama steadies a tilting billboard 10 blocks away, and the correlation becomes impossible to dismiss. News helicopters track Superman as he moves from bridge to power substation to subway entrance, each intervention buying seconds that refuse to add up to safety. Saitama follows at ground level, stepping over buckled pavement with the same casual pace he might use on a quiet sidewalk, and wherever he pauses the world seems to hold its breath. A parking garage that had begun to pancake under its own compromised columns halts mid-collapse when he places a hand against the outer wall, leaving floors suspended at angles no safety code would ever allow. Firefighters evacuate the structure in silence, unsure whether the stabilization will last once he moves on. At the Daily Planet, Lois Lane watches live feeds that make less sense the longer she studies them, noticing that the damage curves outward from Superman's attempts to contain it. Each time he applies force to redirect a failure, another system across the city responds with a misalignment that did not exist moments earlier. She speaks with a civil engineer who explains that stress should travel along predictable paths, dissipating into redundancy rather than reappearing miles away in unrelated infrastructure. What they are seeing instead looks like a ledger being balanced in real time. LexCorp's sensor suite saturates the downtown airspace, its readouts feeding into models that attempt to assign values to events that resist quantification. Luthor listens as his analysts describe a pattern in which Saitama's touch resolves instability without producing any measurable energy exchange, while Superman's calibrated strikes continue to generate environmental responses without corresponding interaction at the point of contact. The conclusion they avoid saying aloud is that one of these men is participating in the city's physics while the other is editing them. Luthor authorizes the release of a statement framing the situation as an emergent hazard requiring coordinated corporate oversight. Emergency broadcasts instruct residents to remain indoors, but indoors has become a category that depends on which building you're in and whether Saitama has passed nearby in the last 5 minutes. A subway tunnel begins to bow under the river's altered currents, and Superman dives to brace the ceiling while commuters run for the exits. The moment he takes the load, a hospital across town loses water pressure as pipes shift in response to a stress that has decided to relocate. Saitama arrives beside the tunnel entrance, glances down at the commuters, and taps the concrete with his toe. The bowing stops without a sound. Military liaison officers arrive at the command post with maps that grow less useful as the minutes pass, because the failures are no longer respecting geography. A data center on the east side overheats when a transformer on the west flickers, and a school gymnasium floor buckles when Superman redirects a falling crane at the docks. The cause and effect chain has stretched into a loop, one that tightens each time the caped figure increases his output to protect civilians. Saitama watches the pattern with mild interest, as if observing a puzzle that refuses to become entertaining. Lois connects the timing of the anomalies to Superman's engagement levels, noticing that the largest system-wide responses follow his most precise interventions. She relays the observation through a back channel that reaches him as he steadies a collapsing overpass, and for a fraction of a second, he hesitates before applying the final adjustment. The overpass holds, but a stadium roof miles away creaks under a load that should not have changed. Saitama appears beside him without warning, looking up at the structure with a faint frown that suggests inconvenience rather than alarm. He jumps toward the stadium in a motion too small to explain the distance he covers, arriving as the roof support truss begins to shear. With a single palm pressed against the metal, he arrests the failure in place, leaving the truss locked at the edge of catastrophe. Spectators inside feel the vibration fade without understanding why, and the public address system continues its announcement as if nothing has happened. Across the city, a water main ruptures with a force that sends a geyser through an empty intersection. Superman lands on the stadium's rim, aware now that each success carries a cost he cannot predict, and that his model of escalation has begun to feed the very instability he's trying to prevent. Saitama removes his hand and looks at the dent his palm has left, as if checking whether it will buff out. The truss remains suspended for a heartbeat, then settles into a new alignment that was not part of any design. In the distance, sirens converge on the intersection where the water main has burst, already straining against a pressure that continues to rise. The decision to escalate beyond municipal control is made in a room far from Metropolis, where the city appears as a live model rather than a place people actually live. Defense analysts present a map that no longer behaves like a map, because the failure points it tracks are not connected by any physical network, yet continue to respond to interventions as if they were. The recommendation is cautious but inevitable. Deploy observation assets first, then containment protocols if the instability begins to propagate beyond city limits. The language is clinical, designed to prevent panic in the chain of command, but the subtext is simple enough to understand. Whatever is happening in Metropolis may not stay there. At the same time, the first global indicator arrives in the form of a transatlantic fiber link that drops packets in a pattern synchronized with Superman's acceleration bursts. Network operations centers in 3 countries flag the anomaly, assuming a cyberattack, until they correlate the timing with public footage of the waterfront and the stadium. The realization that infrastructure on separate continents is responding to a local engagement changes the tone of every subsequent briefing. Satellite constellations are tasked with monitoring atmospheric pressure gradients above Metropolis, searching for any sign that the disturbance has an upper boundary. Back on the ground, Superman moves toward the ruptured water main, already calculating how to vent pressure without triggering another remote failure. Saitama walks beside him with hands in his pockets, glancing at storefront reflections that wobble in response to stresses no one can see. When the geyser comes into view, it's already begun to undermine the street grid, lifting asphalt in slow, deliberate waves. Superman descends to apply a counterforce that will redirect the surge into a drainage channel, but hesitates when he notices the way nearby buildings creak in anticipation. A low-frequency thrum rolls through the air as military drones enter the city's airspace, their presence announced by a broadcast that requests all non-essential aerial activity to clear. Superman hears the directive and understands that it is not meant for him, while Saitama looks up at the formation with mild curiosity. The drones deploy a mesh of sensors designed to measure exotic interactions, the same kind LexCorp attempted earlier, but on a scale that suggests international cooperation. The readouts begin to populate with zeros, where numbers should be. Superman attempts a minimal intervention at the water main, pressing 2 fingers into the concrete lip of the rupture to create a vent path that will relieve pressure. The surge responds by intensifying elsewhere, a fire hydrant 3 blocks away tearing free of its housing with a crack that echoes down an empty street. Saitama steps forward, taps the edge of the rupture with his heel, and the geyser collapses into a steady flow that resumes its intended path through the drainage system. No pressure wave follows, no compensatory failure arrives in response. The drones adjust their formation to focus on Saitama, not because he has requested attention, but because the absence of data has become the most important data point in the city. Analysts watch as his movements produce outcomes without signatures, stabilization without measurable input, and they begin to model the possibility that his presence represents a variable outside their equations. The term they settle on is non-participatory force, a phrase that satisfies no one and explains even less. Upstream, the bridge cable Saitama halted earlier remains suspended in its arrested failure, a loaded decision waiting for resolution. Military engineers request permission to secure it with conventional means, arguing that reliance on an unknown actor is an unacceptable risk. Superman agrees in principle and moves to assist, aware that his involvement may shift the stress elsewhere. As he reaches for the cable, a satellite monitoring the Atlantic reports a transient pressure anomaly that aligns perfectly with his change in velocity. Saitama arrives beside him without any visible transit and places a hand against the steel, as if reminding it to stay where it is. The cable holds, but the river's surface dips by a fraction of a centimeter along its entire width, a change small enough to escape notice but large enough to register on global tide gauges. In command centers around the world, technicians watch the sea hesitate. When global tide gauges begin to log a synchronized dip that cannot be explained by lunar pull or atmospheric pressure, the escalation moves from contingency planning into active coordination between agencies that rarely share the same room. Oceanographic institutes are looped into defense briefings, and the language shifts from citywide anomaly to planetary response in documents that will never be made public. A monitoring buoy in the Pacific records a micro-tilt in sea level that aligns with Superman's attempt to stabilize the bridge cable, and the correlation survives every attempt to dismiss it as coincidence. The implication is not that Metropolis is affecting the oceans, but that something in the act of intervention is being balanced elsewhere. Airspace above the city fills with additional observation platforms, some bearing national insignia, others flying without them, all tuned to detect energy exchanges that continue not to exist. Their instruments report environmental outcomes without corresponding inputs whenever Saitama intervenes, while Superman's precise applications of force produce cascading responses that now appear in power grids as far away as Central City. The conclusion that forms across multiple command centers is that the caped figure's participation is redistributing a stress budget they cannot see. Saitama's presence, by contrast, seems to close accounts without entries. At street level, evacuation routes are extended beyond the metropolitan boundary as a precaution that begins to look like preparation. Superman works through a list of failure points provided by emergency management, choosing interventions that minimize the risk of remote consequences. But the model he's relied on his entire life has lost predictive value. A subway ventilation tower buckles when he redirects a falling crane at the port, and a data relay in Gotham reports packet loss that aligns with his deceleration. Saitama watches the pattern with the same mild interest he has shown since arriving, as if it is a television program that refuses to improve. Military engineers finally secure permission to attempt a conventional fix on the suspended bridge cable, deploying a lattice of braces that should distribute the load along approved paths. Superman assists by holding the primary tension line steady, while the team locks the braces into place, aware that his involvement may shift the burden elsewhere. The moment the final brace clicks, a wind farm hundreds of miles away reports a simultaneous stall across all turbines, their blades pausing as if someone has pressed a global stop button. The stall resolves when Saitama taps the cable with a knuckle, and the river's surface returns to its previous level without ripple. International markets react to the wind farm anomaly with a drop that spreads faster than any physical failure could, halting trading in sectors tied to infrastructure resilience. Insurance consortiums issue advisories that effectively withdraw coverage for force redistribution events, a category that did not exist until this morning. The legal implications begin to outpace the engineering ones, as questions of responsibility multiply in jurisdictions that have never prepared for a physics-based liability. Superman hears none of this, but he feels the way the air resists his movement now, as if the atmosphere has begun to anticipate his choices. A second military formation arrives with containment equipment designed for extraterrestrial engagements, establishing a perimeter around the most active failure zones. Their orders are to observe unless civilian life is at immediate risk, a directive that becomes harder to follow as the list of risks grows. Saitama steps over a line of portable barriers without noticing them, pausing only to look at a cracked hydrant that has started to hiss again. He presses it back into alignment with 2 fingers, and somewhere in the Midwest, a transformer stops whining. Superman takes a position above the river to monitor the bridge, aware that any further intervention may ripple across systems already strained to their limits. The command channel fills with reports from around the world, each one describing a small, inexplicable hesitation in infrastructure that resolves when Saitama moves. The pattern is undeniable now, even if its mechanism remains out of reach. As the sun dips toward the horizon, a satellite tasked with monitoring polar ice registers a transient compression along a fault line that has not shifted in decades. The moment the polar fault line registers compression, the conflict stops being about saving Metropolis and becomes about whether intervention itself is now a form of harm. In the command centers tracking global infrastructure, analysts begin to separate events into 2 categories: outcomes associated with Superman's force and outcomes associated with Saitama's presence. The first produces stability locally and instability remotely, while the second resolves failures without measurable exchange, closing loops that no one else can even see. The working theory that emerges is unsettling. Resistance to collapse may now require surrendering control. Superman hears the update relayed through emergency channels as he hovers above the bridge, watching the arrested cable tremble in a way that suggests decision rather than fatigue. He has spent his entire life learning how to apply just enough strength to keep the world intact, escalating only when necessary, and always with an eye toward minimizing collateral damage. Now, every precise intervention appears to be drawing from a hidden reserve that must be repaid elsewhere, as if the planet itself has begun to audit his choices. Saitama stands beside him with hands in his pockets, following the cable's movement with mild curiosity. A freight train on the city's outskirts reports brake failure at the exact moment Superman braces a failing support beneath the overpass downtown. The correlation arrives before the explanation, and emergency managers scramble to reroute the train toward an empty yard that may not remain empty if the pattern holds. Superman releases the support, allowing the overpass to settle into a compromised but stable alignment, and the brake pressure returns as if someone has exhaled. Saitama looks toward the distant rail line without moving, then back at the bridge. Military containment teams deploy a field of dampeners designed to absorb kinetic transfer, hopping to break the chain between local intervention and remote consequence. Their instruments show promise for less than a minute, during which Superman redirects a falling crane without triggering an immediate anomaly elsewhere. Then, a hospital generator across the state flickers in sympathy with the dampener's load, and the team shuts the field down before it can escalate. The lesson is immediate and unwelcome. Resistance is being accounted for. Lois Lane continues to map the timing of events from the Daily Planet, noticing that the only consistent resolution occurs when Saitama touches a failure point directly. She forwards the observation through channels that reach Superman as he watches the bridge cable begin to unwind again, the earlier stabilization wearing thin. He hesitates, knowing that any attempt to hold it may push the stress into another system, another city, another continent. Saitama steps forward and places his palm against the steel, halting the motion with a gesture that looks almost apologetic. A stadium scoreboard flickers back to life miles away, and a water treatment plant reports normalized pressure without intervention. The global feed fills with similar small recoveries that align with Saitama's movements, each one closing a loop that Superman's actions had opened. The dominance at play is not in strength, but in participation, as if one of them is playing by rules that require balance while the other is exempt. Superman feels the unfamiliar weight of uncertainty settle into his decisions. He tests the boundary with a minimal application of force against a nearby support beam, choosing a vector that should not intersect with any critical system. The beam holds, but a coastal radar array on another continent reports a momentary blind spot that resolves when Saitama taps the bridge cable again. The message is clear enough now to be spoken aloud. Even if no one does, resistance creates debt. As dusk settles over the river, evacuation orders expand to include neighborhoods that have not yet experienced any visible failure. Saitama removes his hand and glances at the sky as if checking the time, while the cable remains suspended in its arrested state. Upstream, a joint that had held all afternoon begins to slip again, the motion already transmitting through systems that no longer respect distance. By nightfall, the pattern has matured into something that cannot be managed with response teams or redirected with careful force, because the failures now appear where no intervention has yet occurred. A wastewater treatment plant on the far side of the state reports a pressure spike the moment Superman steadies a compromised office tower downtown, and a rural dam hundreds of miles away logs a stress fluctuation that aligns with his deceleration over the river. Analysts begin to describe the system as anticipatory, redistributing potential instability ahead of any action that might contain it. Saitama watches the tower settle with mild interest, then looks down at a cracked sidewalk as if deciding whether to step over it. Command authorizes a limited disengagement, instructing Superman to reduce active intervention in order to observe whether the redistribution slows in his absence. The decision runs counter to every instinct he has, because doing nothing while structures fail is not a strategy he has ever accepted. He pulls back to a higher altitude, tracking the city as a network of tensions rather than a collection of people, and within minutes, a parking structure begins to tilt near a school that has not yet finished evacuating. The delay feels like consent. Saitama arrives before the tilt becomes collapse, placing a hand against the outer column with the same absent-minded posture he has used all day. The structure pauses at an angle that would terrify any engineer, then settles into a new alignment that was never part of its design. Across the city, a wind tunnel used for aeronautical testing reports a normalization of pressure without any input from its operators. The global feed fills with similar quiet recoveries. Military observers note that each time Saitama intervenes, previously migrating failures stop migrating, as if a debt has been forgiven rather than paid. The language in their reports begins to change from containment to accommodation, a shift that alarms policymakers who hear surrender where engineers hear survival. Superman descends toward the school anyway, unable to watch from a distance while buses struggle to clear the loading zone. The moment he lifts a fallen beam from the street, a data center in another country experiences a cooling failure that resolves when Saitama taps the pavement beside the beam. Lois Lane broadcasts the correlation in real time, careful to avoid conclusions that would inflame panic, and the public begins to notice that stabilization follows the stranger's touch. Calls flood emergency lines requesting his presence at failure points, as if he were a utility rather than a person. Saitama seems not to hear any of it, stepping around a toppled mailbox and pressing it back into place with 2 fingers. Somewhere in the city, a transformer stops whining. Superman tests another minimal intervention at the edge of the evacuation zone, bracing a light pole that threatens to fall across a bus route. The pole steadies, but a coastal desalination plant reports a pressure anomaly that resolves when Saitama flicks a loose bolt into alignment on the same street. The ledger closes again without entry. Resistance continues to open accounts. As midnight approaches, the bridge upstream emits a low, steady hum that carries across the water, its suspended cable trembling in the night air. Saitama looks toward it with the same faint frown he showed at the stadium, then hops onto the guardrail with a motion too small to explain the distance he covers. Superman follows, aware that the next decision may determine whether the pattern tightens or breaks. The cable begins to unwind once more, its motion already echoing through systems that have learned to answer from afar. The cable does not unwind so much as decide to, its motion steady and deliberate in a way that makes the surrounding silence feel staged. Across the city, unrelated systems begin to respond before any visible change occurs at the bridge. A hospital ventilation network adjusting its dampers, a refinery's pressure valves tightening without command. The global feeds that have tracked this pattern all day light up with preemptive anomalies, each one aligned to the rate at which the steel strands separate under their own suspended decision. Saitama reaches out to stop it, and the world seems to wait for permission. Superman moves at the same moment, not to overpower the failure but to guide it into a safer resolution, applying a vector that should allow the cable to release without transferring its load into the bridge's spine. The instant his hand closes around the steel, the river beneath them dips again, a fraction of a centimeter that echoes along coastlines continents away. A coastal levee reports a sudden rise in stress, and a glacier monitoring station in the Arctic logs a compression event that will take months to propagate in any normal model. Saitama's palm meets the cable a heartbeat later, and the motion halts. For a second that stretches beyond measurement, nothing else moves anywhere. Then the consequences arrive not as collapse but as subtraction, as if the system that has balanced their interventions all day has decided to close a larger account. A suspension tower 2 miles away loses a non-critical brace that should have held for years, and the bridge deck there sags just enough to render the structure permanently unsafe. No one is on it, evacuation having cleared the span earlier, but the loss is irreversible, a piece of the city that will never carry traffic again. Emergency managers mark it as decommissioned before the dust has settled. Superman releases the cable immediately, understanding that any further participation may widen the subtraction, and watches as Saitama keeps the steel from unwinding with 2 fingers. The hum in the air deepens into a tone that instruments cannot place, resonating through the riverbanks and into bedrock that has not shifted in recorded history. A hydroelectric dam hundreds of miles away reports a microfracture in a spillway that will require months of repair, and insurance algorithms begin to reprice risk across entire regions. Military command attempts to impose a freeze on all interventions, issuing a directive that no further force be applied until the redistribution slows. The order arrives as a shopping mall atrium begins to shed glass into an empty concourse, and Superman feels the familiar pull to act. He does not move, and the atrium settles into a compromised alignment that will stand until morning crews can shore it up. Saitama glances toward the mall without stepping away from the cable. LexCorp's analysts flag a planetary magnetometer reading that deviates by a hair's breadth, then returns to baseline when Saitama adjusts his grip. The implication is too large to speak aloud, that stabilization here may be costing integrity elsewhere in ways they cannot yet see. Lois Lane reports the permanent loss of the suspension tower on air, careful to note that no lives were taken, and the public begins to understand that the ledger has begun to collect infrastructure instead. The bridge cable remains still beneath Saitama's hand, but upstream a joint slips with a sound that carries across the water like a door closing. The global feed fills with fresh anomalies that do not wait for intervention, each one a small subtraction from systems that have held for decades. Superman hovers beside him, aware that the scale of the conflict has outgrown any city, any nation. The new anomalies do not announce themselves with collapse or fire, but with absences in systems that have never known interruption, as if the planet has begun to blink in places no one thought to watch. A transcontinental pipeline reports a momentary vacuum that resolves before any valve can respond, while a weather satellite logs a pressure gradient that does not align with any atmospheric front. These events arrive without visible cause, yet their timing threads back to the river where Saitama's fingers still rest against the bridge cable. Superman feels the way the air changes when he shifts position, a resistance that suggests the system is already accounting for his next move. Emergency managers widen evacuation zones beyond any rational perimeter, not because the city is collapsing, but because the map of risk has become a rumor. A coastal airport grounds flights when its runway sensors register a transient misalignment, and a power plant across the ocean reroutes load to prevent a surge that never arrives. The pattern has matured into anticipation, redistributing stress ahead of intervention, as if resistance itself were a forecast. Saitama watches the cable with mild interest, then glances at the river as though considering whether to skip a stone. Superman descends toward a hospital where a backup generator has begun to oscillate, aware that any contact may shift the burden elsewhere. He chooses the smallest possible adjustment, aligning a fuel line that has vibrated loose under the day's accumulating tensions. The generator steadies, and a port authority in another country reports a crane lock failing in sympathy. Before the failure can propagate, Saitama taps the bridge cable with a knuckle, and the crane's lock resets without explanation. Military observers now speak openly of a dominance that has nothing to do with strength, modeling scenarios in which non-participation might slow the ledger's collection. Their simulations fail to account for the way civilian life demands action in the moment, for the way a falling sign over a crowded sidewalk cannot be ignored while waiting for global models to converge. Superman returns to the river with the knowledge that doing less may be the only way to save more, and finds Saitama still holding the steel in place. A tremor runs through the ground that is too smooth to be called an earthquake, passing beneath the city without disturbing a single glass of water. Seismic stations on 3 continents register the motion, their waveforms flat where peaks should be, as if the planet has shrugged. The bridge joint upstream slips another fraction, and the cable beneath Saitama's hand begins to unwind again, its motion already echoing through networks that no longer respect distance. He presses his palm flat, and the motion stops. In the distance, a coastal levee that had held through every storm of the last decade settles into a new alignment that will require it to be rebuilt from the foundation. No one is injured, but the loss is permanent. Another subtraction entered into a ledger no one can see. Lois Lane reports the development with a steadiness that carries across households already packing to leave. Superman hovers beside Saitama, aware that each stabilization may be costing something beyond the horizon, and that resistance has begun to feel like defiance of a system that balances outcomes rather than intentions. The river's surface dips once more by a fraction that tide gauges will record for years, and upstream the joint slips again, already transmitting its decision through a world that has learned to answer. By the time the next slip travels through the bridge's upstream joint, the global feeds are no longer asking whether intervention causes redistribution, but how much the system will take in exchange for each act of stabilization. A desalination plant on another continent logs a permanent loss in throughput when Superman steadies a failing communications mast near the river, and a mountain observatory reports a hairline fracture in its primary mirror that will take years to replace. The world is not ending in fire, but in quiet forfeitures that accumulate into absence. Saitama keeps the cable from unwinding with 2 fingers, as if holding a place in a book. Emergency Command issues a standing order for Superman to disengage from all non-life-threatening failures, prioritizing evacuation over containment. He follows it where he can, hovering above neighborhoods that have not yet felt any visible strain, watching as people file into buses under a sky that looks unchanged. A shopping district loses power when he shifts position to intercept a falling antenna, and the lights return when Saitama presses the bridge's steel back into stillness. The pattern has become a language everyone understands without wanting to speak. LexCorp's analysts detect a minute change in Earth's rotational wobble that resolves when Saitama adjusts his grip, the reading dismissed, and then reinstated when a second instrument confirms it. The implication arrives in silence across the room, too large for any of them to own. Stabilization here is being balanced somewhere else, in systems that will never appear on a city map. Lois Lane's broadcast carries footage of a levee that has settled into a permanent lean, its loss measured in future storms rather than present lives. Superman tests the boundary once more with the smallest intervention he can manage, lifting a sagging traffic light to clear an evacuation route. A coastal radar array half a world away reports a persistent blind spot that does not resolve until Saitama taps the cable again. The ledger closes, and the blind spot returns to baseline. Resistance continues to open accounts that only Saitama seems able to close without entry. Midnight deepens, and the bridge emits a tone that has begun to synchronize with the low-frequency hum recorded by seismic stations worldwide. The cable beneath Saitama's hand trembles as the upstream joint slips again, its motion already answered by a substation in another country that reports a transformer locking into a new alignment. Superman hovers beside him, aware now that the scale of the exchange has outgrown any single decision he can make. Saitama looks down at the steel with a faint frown that suggests inconvenience, then flattens his palm against it as the strands begin to separate. The unwinding stops, and a glacier monitoring station logs a calving event that will reshape a coastline over decades. No one here will see it, but the entry has been made. The evacuation perimeter expands once more as the joint upstream settles into a compromised position that will not recover. The river dips by another fraction, already recorded by tide gauges that cannot explain why. Superman understands that the next move will decide whether the ledger collects again, and that doing nothing may not be an option much longer. By the time the final upstream joint begins to move, the decision has already been framed by everything they've learned and everything they've lost without bloodshed. The cable beneath Saitama's hand trembles with a steady insistence that no longer feels mechanical, its motion already answered by distant systems that have learned to anticipate the exchange. A coastal floodgate settles into a permanent misalignment as Superman shifts his altitude by a meter, and a telecommunications hub across the ocean reports a relay slipping into a configuration that will require a full rebuild. The ledger is collecting faster now. Emergency Command transmits a single instruction to Superman that arrives stripped of protocol. Do not intervene unless lives are in immediate danger. It is a directive that asks him to unlearn the reflex that has defined him, to watch a structure fail in order to prevent a continent from paying for its survival. Below, the bridge deck sags by a fraction that will render it permanently unsafe, evacuation having cleared it hours ago. The loss is certain either way. Saitama looks at the cable with the same mild frown he has worn since the stadium, then glances towards Superman as if asking whether this is still necessary. There is no posture in the look, no challenge, just a practical question that carries more weight than any threat. The strands begin to separate in earnest, their motion already mirrored by a substation in another hemisphere that locks into a new alignment. The world holds its breath without knowing why. Superman does not move. Saitama presses his palm flat against the steel, and the unwinding stops in a way that instruments will later fail to record. Across the globe, a wind farm that had stalled hours ago spins back to life, and a hospital generator steadies without human input. No compensatory failure arrives, no remote system shifts to pay for the stabilization here. The ledger does not open. For the first time since morning, Superman applies a minimal force to a nearby support beam without triggering a distant response, the adjustment resolving a local strain without cost elsewhere. He tests another vector, aligning a loose guardrail at the bridge's edge, and again the global feeds remain quiet. The pattern that has defined the day has changed, not because the world has grown kinder, but because the rule has been rewritten by the simple fact of Saitama's touch. The bridge remains compromised, its deck settling into an alignment that will never carry traffic again, and the suspension tower lost earlier will not be rebuilt in the same place. Insurance markets will treat this day as a dividing line, and engineering codes will be rewritten around an absence they cannot name. Evacuation orders will lift in the morning, but the map of risk will never look the same. Saitama removes his hand and looks at the dent his palm has left, as if checking whether it will buff out. The river's surface returns to a level that tide gauges will record without commentary, and the low-frequency hum beneath the city fades into something that might be called silence. Superman hovers beside him, aware that the world has learned a new rule it did not ask for. Metropolis will stand, but not as it did before, and neither will any place that watched the ledger collect and then refuse to open. Somewhere far away, a levee that had leaned all night remains as it is, a reminder that not every entry can be undone.